Hello, curious souls, and welcome back to the Conscious Catalyst. So if you listened to the last episode, you'll know that we left things in a perfectly reasonable place. By reasonable, I mean we spent an hour discussing whether the Great Pyramid was a tomb, a power station, a healing chamber, a resonance machine, an initiation temple, a consciousness amplifying device, or potentially an ancient stargate. So naturally, the next logical question is, what on earth was Atlantis actually capable of? Because once you start pulling on the Atlantis thread, it quickly stops becoming a story about a lost island and starts sounding like someone merged advanced physics, consciousness studies, sacred geometry, quantum mechanics, crystal engineering, and a science fiction convention into a single civilization. At this point in my research history, I should probably disclose that my internet search algorithm is deeply concerned for my well-being. I currently have 47 browser tabs open. I have 15 books next to my bed and notes saying, "Ask why all ancient civilizations suddenly got obsessed with the stars." And could megalithic structures have used acoustic levitation through harmonic resonance while operating as interdimensional consciousness interfaces? I am no longer in control of this investigation, and the algorithm and I are no longer speaking. So grab yourself a coffee and welcome to the Atlantis Trilogy Part 1. This is, was Atlantis real, and has humanity devolved? So I sat down to plan a single episode on Atlantis, and that lasted about 5 minutes, because the deeper I went, the more I realized Atlantis isn't just a story about a lost civilization, it's a gateway into some of the biggest questions humanity has ever asked. Did advanced civilization exist before recorded history? Are ancient flood myths describing a real global catastrophe? Did knowledge survive that catastrophe and shape the ancient world? And if it did, where did that knowledge go? No pun intended, but once I started researching Atlantis, my mind completely flooded with ideas. What began as one episode quickly became a 3-part investigation. There was simply too much material to explore reasonably in a single episode. This series won't be about blindly accepting or dismissing any particular theory. Instead, it's about following the evidence, the stories, the mysteries, and the patterns wherever they lead. So, before we begin episode 1, here's the roadmap. Episode 1 is, was Atlantis real, and has humanity devolved? This episode will examine the foundation of the Atlantis mystery. We'll start where most discussions begin, with Plato and his famous accounts in Timaeus and Critias. Here we go again. Critias. From there, we'll follow the historical trail through writers such as Proclus, Diodorus Siculus, and Theopompus, exploring whether Atlantis existed only as a philosophical allegory or whether Plato may have been preserving a much older tradition. You have to excuse me because my Greek is terrible. In my mind, my soul just must have wandered from Atlantis, like just straight into Egypt with Thoth. That's Thoth, if anyone is familiar with him. Like when I checked my Akashic records for Greece, I was just like, it was just blank. There was nothing there. So I had to get into the history books. Anyway, so we'll also examine the flood myths found across cultures worldwide and ask a fascinating question. Why do so many ancient civilizations remember a great flood, a lost age, or a world-ending catastrophe? From there, we'll move into the modern era, exploring the work of researchers and writers such as Ignatius Donnelly, Edgar Cayce, Graham Hancock, Robert Schoch, and W. Scott Elliott, Dolores Cannon, and of course, David Wilcock. Some approached Atlantis through history, some through geology, some through psychic investigation, and others through alternative interpretations of ancient evidence. The goal is not to prove Atlantis. The goal is to establish whether there is enough smoke to justify looking for the fire. The curious question, did Atlantis really exist? Part 2 of the trilogy will be Atlantis Before the Fall, Ancient Advanced Technology, and the Fifth Dimension. If Atlantis did exist, what kind of civilization was it? This is where we move beyond the historical record and into the extraordinary claims surrounding Atlantis. We'll explore descriptions of a civilization said to have combined advanced technology with an expanded understanding of consciousness. Concepts such as crystal technologies, resonance, frequency, sacred geometry, anti-gravity, consciousness-based science, and the possibility of tech knowledge that seem impossible from a modern perspective. We'll also examine traditions that describe Atlantis as a civilization operating at a higher state of awareness, sometimes referred to as a fifth dimensional society. But what does that actually mean? Is it purely spiritual symbolism, a misunderstood technological paradigm, or something else entirely? We'll explore concepts found in the Law of One material, accounts involving the Melchizedeks, stories of competing factions within Atlantis, and theories about how Atlantean technologies may have functioned if there is any truth behind the legends. Whether you view these accounts as metaphysical teachings, encoded history, or imaginative mythology, they form a major part of the Atlantis narrative and deserve careful examination. The central question, what was Atlantis capable of, and was it truly an advanced civilization operating beyond our current understanding of science and consciousness? Part 3 of the trilogy will be The Fall, Thoth, and the Hidden Legacy. Every civilization rises, every civilization falls. If Atlantis existed, what brought it to an end? This episode will explore accounts of catastrophic destruction, from floods and earthquakes to pole shifts, cosmic cycles, and environmental collapse. We'll examine the role of Poseidon within the Atlantis narrative and explore the traditions surrounding Thoth, the legendary keeper of wisdom, said by some esoteric traditions to have survived the cataclysm and carried sacred knowledge into Egypt and beyond. We'll separate historical evidence from legend as we compare the ancient Hermetic Emerald Tablet with the much later Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean, which is a distinction that is often overlooked. From there, we'll venture into the deepest end of the pool. Theories involving hidden repositories of knowledge, the mystery schools, Antarctica, the Nazi fascination with ancient civilizations, Cold War legends involving hidden technologies, the Watchers, and the possibility that fragments of an ancient legacy may still exist today. Whether these ideas ultimately hold up or collapse under scrutiny, they remain some of the most fascinating threads in the Atlantis story. The central question, what happened to the knowledge, and could any of it still remain hidden today? How this investigation will work. Throughout the trilogy, we'll examine Atlantis through 4 distinct layers of evidence. Historical fact, surviving texts, archaeology, geology, oceanography, and documented history. This is the strongest evidentiary category and provides the foundation for everything else. Ancient accounts. This covers what ancient writers, priests, and chroniclers recorded. These accounts deserve attention, but they won't automatically be treated as literal history. Alternative hypothesis. Theories proposed by modern researchers attempting to explain anomalies, patterns, and unexplained evidence. Some may prove compelling, others may not survive scrutiny. Esoteric and channeled accounts. This includes material from sources such as Edgar Cayce, Dolores canon, the Law of One, and other traditions claiming access to knowledge beyond conventional historical records. I understand this category is controversial. However, humanity has always preserved knowledge claimed to have originated from divine revelation, spiritual inspiration, or direct communion with a higher intelligence, or what I refer to as the source or quantum field. Many of the world's most influential religious and spiritual texts emerged through exactly that process. Whether these sources are ultimately historical, symbolic, psychological, or genuinely metaphysical remains an open question. In my view, they deserve to be examined rather than dismissed outright. A note: I'm not placing every source of information in the same evidentiary category. A geological study is not the same as a channeled text. An ancient inscription is not the same as a modern hypnosis session. A historical document is not equivalent to an esoteric teaching. But what I find fascinating, and what this series will explore, is the recurring pattern that emerges when these very different streams of information are placed side by side. Why do so many independent traditions, separated by time, geography, and methodology, appear to converge on similar themes? A great civilization, a catastrophic fall, knowledge preserved by a small number of survivors, and a legacy that may still be influencing humanity today. That's the question we'll be investigating over the next 3 episodes. So, welcome to part 1, Was Atlantis Real? We're going to start with the flood myths. One of the most surprising discoveries I made while researching Atlantis wasn't Plato, the Great Pyramid, or even the possibility of a lost civilization. It was the sheer number of flood stories found across the world. Once you begin looking for them, they seem to appear almost everywhere. Ancient cultures separated by vast oceans, different languages, and thousands of years of history all tell stories about a time when the world as they knew it was destroyed by water. What makes these stories so intriguing is not merely their existence, but the similarities they share. Again and again, the same narrative pattern emerges. There is an earlier world or civilization. A devastating flood approaches. A small group of people receives a warning or survives through special knowledge. Life, animals, seeds, wisdom, or sacred teachings are preserved. The old world disappears and a new age begins. These recurring themes appear so frequently that they raise a fascinating question. Are these merely symbolic stories, or are they distant memories of something that humanity once experienced? The oldest surviving written flood stories come from Mesopotamia, often referred to as the cradle of civilization. In the Atlantis epic, and later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods decide that humanity will be destroyed by a great flood. One man receives advanced warning, constructs a vessel, preserves life, and survives the cataclysm. The story then transitions into the rebuilding of the world after the waters recede. These accounts predate the biblical story of Noah by many centuries and are among the earliest flood traditions ever recorded. The biblical account of Noah follows a remarkably similar structure. Humanity has become corrupt. Divine judgment is declared. A chosen individual is warned. An ark is built, animals are preserved, and a catastrophic flood destroys the old world. Whether one interprets the story literally, symbolically, or spiritually, the structure is strikingly familiar when compared with the earlier Mesopotamian narratives. In Greece, we encounter the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. According to the myth, Zeus decides humanity has fallen into corruption and sends a great flood to cleanse the earth. Deucalion and his wife survive and eventually repopulate the world. Once again, we find the same underlying narrative: destruction, survival, and renewal. What's particularly interesting is that the flood tradition exists within the same broad cultural heritage that eventually produced Plato, the very source of the Atlantis story. Moving east to India, we find the story of Manu, one of the most famous flood traditions in Hindu mythology. Manu is warned by a mysterious fish, later revealed to be an incarnation of Vishnu, that a world-ending flood is approaching. He is instructed to build a vessel and preserve life. When the flood arrives, the boat is guided to safety and humanity begins again afterwards. The details are unique to Hindu tradition, yet the central themes are unmistakably familiar. What becomes even more compelling is that the flood stories are not confined to Europe, the Middle East, or Asia. Similar traditions can be found throughout North and South America among Hopi, Maya, Aztec, Inca, and many other indigenous cultures. Variations also appear in Polynesian traditions and Aboriginal Australian narratives. While the specific details differ, the recurring memory of a great flood that destroyed an earlier world appears again and again across continents that had no direct contact with one another for much of history. Of course, skeptics point out that floods are common natural disasters. Human societies have always settled near rivers, lakes, and coastlines, making flooding a frequent and traumatic event. It is entirely possible that different cultures independently developed flood myths to explain natural catastrophes. That is a reasonable explanation and one that should be considered. However, there is another layer to this mystery. Modern geology tells us that at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically. Between approximately 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, global sea levels increased by more than 120 meters. Entire coastlines vanished beneath the ocean. Vast regions that were once dry land disappeared forever beneath rising seas. Places such as Doggerland, which once connected Britain to mainland Europe, eventually disappeared beneath the North Sea. Large areas of Southeast Asia, known as Sunderland, were also inundated. Around the world, coastlines migrated inland as glaciers melted and oceans expanded. If ancient populations had been living along these now submerged coastal regions, as many researchers believe there were, their worlds would have literally vanished beneath the sea. This is where Graham Hancock enters the conversation. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, Hancock has become one of the most influential modern researchers exploring the relationship between ancient myths and prehistoric catastrophes. His central argument is that many flood traditions may have been preserving memories of real events that occurred near the end of the Ice Age. Specifically, Hancock points to a period approximately 12,800 years ago, at the beginning of an abrupt climate event known as the Younger Dryas. According to Hancock's interpretation, fragments of a giant comet may have struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere around this time. The resulting environmental upheaval could have triggered widespread fires, rapid climate change, melting ice sheets, rising sea levels, and devastating floods. In this scenario, any advanced coastal societies that existed during the Ice Age would have been particularly vulnerable to destruction. This brings us back to Atlantis. Plato tells us that Atlantis was destroyed approximately 9,000 years before the time of Solon. When that timeline is converted into modern dating, it places the destruction of Atlantis roughly 9,600 BCE or around 11,600 years ago. Remarkably, that date falls extremely close to the end of the Younger Dryas period, which ended around 11,700 years ago. Hancock argues that this overlap may not be a coincidence. Instead, he suggests that Plato's account could represent a distant cultural memory of real catastrophes that occurred at the end of the Ice Age. Now, None of this proves that Atlantis existed. It also doesn't prove that every flood myth refers to the same event. But what it does demonstrate is that three separate pieces of the puzzle continue to intersect in fascinating ways. First, flood narratives appear throughout the world. Second, geology confirms that enormous flooding and sea level rise occurred at the end of the Ice Age. Third, the timeline Plato gives for Atlantis aligns surprisingly closely with one of the most dramatic periods of environmental change in human prehistory. The question then is not whether the floods happened. We know they did. The question is whether ancient cultures were preserving memories of those events in their myths, legends, and sacred traditions. If they were, then Atlantis may not simply be a legend about a sunken island. It may be the surviving memory of a lost chapter of human history, a chapter that existed before the end of the Ice Age and was largely erased when the seas rose and the world changed forever. Ancient sites, impossible stones, and the question of lost knowledge. If the flood myths raise the possibility that humanity may be remembering a forgotten catastrophe, then the next logical question is, what survived? Because if there really was an advanced civilization living before the great floods and rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, we might expect some trace of its knowledge to have endured, not necessarily in the form of written records, which are fragile and easily lost to time, but perhaps in something far more permanent, stone. This is where the mystery becomes remarkably tangible. Across Egypt, Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, Lebanon, and countless other ancient sites, we find monumental structures built on a scale that continues to inspire awe. We encounter enormous blocks weighing dozens and sometimes hundreds of tons. We find precision stonework that appears almost impossible to separate with a blade. We discover sacred sites aligned to the movement of the sun, moon, the stars, and the constellations with extraordinary accuracy. And throughout many of these sites, we encounter recurring themes of geometry, mathematics, astronomy, and symbolism that seems to hint at a deeper body of knowledge. Mainstream archaeology provides one explanation for these achievements. Alternative researchers provide another, and esoteric traditions suggest something stranger still. The Great Pyramid of Giza is perhaps the most famous example. For more than 4,000 years, it has dominated the Giza Plateau, standing as one of the most precisely aligned structures ever built. Mainstream Egyptology views it as the culmination of generations of engineering skill, organization, mathematics, and human labor constructed using tools available to the ancient Egyptians. But after what we explored in episode 1, I think it's fair to say some uncomfortable questions remain. We examined the extraordinary precision of the Great Pyramid, its mathematical relationships, its curious internal design, its acoustic qualities, its apparent incorporation of astronomical knowledge, and the ongoing debate over whether it functions solely as a tomb. We explored theories suggesting it may have served as something far more sophisticated, a resonance chamber, a power generator, an initiation structure, a healing device, or perhaps something we have not yet identified. Whether those theories are ultimately correct is not really the point. The point is that the deeper you examine the Great Pyramid, the harder it becomes to dismiss it as simply a pile of stones stacked by Bronze Age workers dragging blocks up ramps. In fact, if humanity decided today to recreate the Great Pyramid exactly as it stands, with the same precision, orientation, scale, and engineering tolerances, we would be undertaking one of the most ambitious construction projects in modern history, which naturally raises a question that many people are increasingly willing to ask. If we would struggle to replicate it today using all of our modern technology, are we completely sure we understand how it was built in the first place? To be clear, asking that question does not automatically prove Atlantis. It does not prove lost civilizations, anti-gravity technology, giant crystals, or interdimensional architects, but it does suggest that the conversation may not be as settled as we're often told. Because once you begin questioning the limits of ancient engineering at Giza, it's remarkable how quickly similar questions begin appearing at sites all over the world. The same questions arise in South America. At Sacsayhuaman, overlooking Cusco in Peru, enormous polygonal stone blocks fit together with such precision that even today they appear almost impossibly engineered. Many of the stones possess irregular shapes, yet interlock perfectly with neighbouring blocks. The walls seem less like conventional masonry and more like gigantic three-dimensional puzzles assembled with astonishing accuracy. Further south at sites such as Ollantaytambo and Machu Picchu, the mystery deepens. Massive stones have been cut, shaped, and fitted together in ways that continue to impress modern engineers and architects. Visitors often leave these sites with a profound sense that the builders possess techniques and skills that deserve far more attention than they are typically given. Then we arrive at Bolivia, at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. Here we encounter some of the most debated archaeological sites on Earth. Gigantic stone blocks, precise angles, intricate cuts, drilled holes, and remarkably flat surfaces have led some researchers to question whether conventional explanations fully account for what we observe. Mainstream archaeology attributes these achievements to the ingenuity and craftsmanship of ancient cultures working over long periods of time. Alternative researchers argue that the level of precision hints at technologies or methods that have since been forgotten. What is fascinating is not that everyone agrees on what these sites represent. It is that they don't. The stones themselves are not mysterious. The mystery lies in how we interpret them. As we examine these sites collectively, another pattern begins to emerge. Ancient civilizations appear to have been intensely preoccupied with the heavens. Throughout the world, we find structures aligned with solstices, equinoxes, lunar cycles, stellar movements, and celestial events. Entire sacred complexes seem designed around astronomical observations. Whether we look at Egypt, Mesoamerica, Peru, Britain, or countless other locations, we repeatedly find an extraordinary awareness of the sky woven into architecture. For mainstream scholars, this reflects practical needs such as agriculture, navigation, timekeeping, religious ritual, and social organization. Ancient people depended on understanding the heavens because their survival often depended on understanding the seasons. For alternative researchers, however, these alignments may point towards something far more profound. They argue that the recurring astronomical knowledge found across distant civilizations could represent fragments of inherited wisdom handed down from an earlier age. And this is where Atlantis begins to re-enter the conversation. Researchers such as Graham Hancock have proposed that if a sophisticated Ice Age civilization existed before a global catastrophe, survivors may have carried fragments of their knowledge into cultures that emerged afterward. In this interpretation, the great monuments of the ancient world become more than buildings. They become repositories of memory. They become stone libraries, preserving astronomical, mathematical, and cosmological knowledge long after the civilization that originated it disappeared. Whether one accepts that idea or not, it offers a compelling possibility. It may help explain why so many early civilizations appear to emerge with surprisingly sophisticated understandings of geometry, surveying, astronomy, and architecture. Then we arrive at the most speculative and perhaps most fascinating layer of the mystery. According to many esoteric traditions, these monuments were not simply symbolic structures. They were functional technologies. The Great Pyramid was not merely a tomb, it was a resonance chamber. Temples were not merely places of worship. They were centers of initiation and consciousness development. Sacred geometry was not decorative symbolism. It was an applied science. And the relationship between sound, frequency, consciousness, and matter formed part of a body of knowledge that humanity has largely forgotten. This is where discussions of crystal technology, harmonic resonance, energy fields, consciousness-based science, and higher states of awareness begin to emerge. Whether these ideas represent historical reality, metaphor, spiritual teaching, or something in between remains a matter of debate. But they form a central part of the Atlantis narrative and cannot be ignored if we are to understand the full story. Because once we move beyond the question of whether Atlantis existed, a far more intriguing question appears. What if Atlantis wasn't remembered because it was powerful? What if Atlantis was remembered because it understood something fundamental about consciousness, energy, and the nature of reality that humanity later lost? And if that's the case, then before we can understand how Atlantis fell, we first need to understand what Atlantis was said to be. Where did the Atlantis story actually begin? Plato, the foundational account. Regardless of whether one approaches Atlantis through history, mythology, archaeology, alternative research, or channeled material, the earliest surviving detailed written account of Atlantis is found in Plato's dialogues of Timaeus and Critias, written about around 360 BCE. It's important to establish that Plato doesn't present Atlantis as something he invented. Instead, he carefully constructs a chain of transmission which he claims stretches back through several generations. According to Plato, the story originated with Egyptian priests in the ancient city of Cayce. During his travels in Egypt, the famous Atlantean statesman Solon is said to have learned the story from these priests. Solon then brought the account back to Greece, where it was preserved through family tradition before eventually being recounted by Critias and recorded by Plato. In other words, the chain of transmission presented within the dialogue is Egyptian priests to Solon, Critias family to Plato. Plato goes out of his way to emphasize that he is not presenting the story as a newly invented tale. The Atlantis story first appears in Timaeus. The dialogue begins with Socrates asking for an example of an ideal state put into action. In response, Critias offers what he claims is a true account from remote antiquity. He recounts how Solon visited Egypt and met priests who told him that Greek civilization had forgotten much of its own ancient history because repeated catastrophes had wiped away previous ages of humanity. One priest tells Solon that Greece remembers only the most recent flood of Deucalion, when in reality there had been many destructions of mankind through fire and water over immense spans of time. This is an important detail because Plato is already introducing one of the key themes that continues to resonate with Atlantis research today. The idea that civilizations can be lost, memories erased, and history reset by catastrophic events. The Egyptian priests then reveal that approximately 9,000 years before Solon's time, there existed a great island empire known as Atlantis. According to Plato, Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient name for what we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar. Beyond that narrow passage into the Atlantic Ocean was, he says, a large island that served as the gateway to many other islands and lands beyond. Plato describes Atlantis as an extraordinarily wealthy and powerful state. It possessed fertile plains, abundant natural resources, forests, wildlife, precious metals, and advanced infrastructure. One metal receives particular attention. I can't say it. Orichalcum. I don't want to say. Oh. Okay, let's try that again. All right, one metal receives particular attention. Orichalcum, a mysterious substance described as being second only to gold in value. The most famous section of the account concerns Atlantis' capital city. According to Plato, the city was built around a central hill where Poseidon had established his sanctuary. The city consisted of concentric rings of land and water, alternating in circular bands radiating outward from the center. These rings were connected by bridges and canals, creating a complex system through which ships could travel directly into the heart of the city. This is one of the reasons Atlantis has endured in the public imagination for so long. Plato doesn't simply tell us Atlantis existed. He describes it in remarkable detail. He discusses harbors, canals, defensive walls, temples, royal succession, laws, military organization. He even discusses measurements and dimensions. For a civilization that many scholars consider fictional, Plato dedicates an unusual amount of energy to explaining how it functioned. At the center of the city stood the great temple of Poseidon and Cleito. Plato describes it as immense and richly decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum. Inside stood giant statues, including a colossal representation of Poseidon driving a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses. Poseidon himself occupies a central role in the narrative. According to the story, Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito. To protect her, he enclosed the hill on which she lived with concentric rings of land and sea. Together they had 10 sons, who became the rulers of Atlantis. The eldest son was Atlas. Plato tells us that Atlas inherited the central kingdom and became the supreme ruler among his brothers. The island itself took its name from Atlas, and according to Plato, so did the Atlantic Ocean. Initially, Atlantis is portrayed as an exemplary civilization. The rulers governed according to divine laws inherited from Poseidon. The society was prosperous, disciplined, and virtuous. Its immense wealth and power were balanced by wisdom, self-restraint, and respect for higher principles. But this golden age does not last. One of Plato's recurring philosophical themes is that societies decay when virtue gives way to desire. Atlantis becomes a perfect illustration of this principle. Generation after generation, the Atlanteans become increasingly attached to material wealth and worldly power. Sounding familiar? According to Plato, Atlantis expanded its influence across large parts of North Africa and Europe. It began subjugating other peoples and sought to extend its power beyond its original boundaries. This expansion brings Atlantis into conflict with an ancient version of Athens. In Plato's account, ancient Athens represents the ideal state, courageous, virtuous, and committed to freedom. When Atlantis attempts to dominate the Mediterranean world, Athens leads the resistance. Despite the overwhelming power of Atlantis, the Athenians emerge victorious. It is at this point that the story moves towards its dramatic conclusion. Shortly after the war, Plato tells us that violent earthquakes and floods struck the region. In what has become one of the most quoted passages in all of Atlantis literature, he writes that Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea in a single dreadful day and night. The island sank. The civilization vanished, and the sea where Atlantis once stood supposedly became impassable due to mud and shoals left behind by the catastrophe. Yet what makes the Atlantis story even more mysterious is that Plato never actually finishes it. The dialogue Critias breaks off abruptly just as Zeus begins gathering the gods to address the moral corruption of Atlantis. We never hear the speech. We never receive the final judgment. We never see Plato's intended conclusion. The text simply ends. And perhaps that is one reason Atlantis continues to fascinate us. Because more than 2,000 years later, we still cannot answer the fundamental question. Was Plato recording a genuine historical tradition preserved by Egyptian priests? Was he constructing a political and philosophical allegory about the rise and fall of civilizations? Was he weaving together fragments of real memories, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, and societal collapse into a single narrative? Or was he doing all three at once? Whatever the answer, every investigation into Atlantis begins with Plato, because without Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis would not exist as a mystery at all. It would simply be another lost story, swallowed by the passage of time. Proclus and the question of whether Atlantis was meant to be taken literally. If Plato is the foundation of the Atlantis story, then one of the most important later voices is Proclus, a 5th century Neoplatonist philosopher who lived nearly 800 years after Plato. While Proclus did not provide new evidence for Atlantis, he is significant because he preserved discussions that were already taking place in the ancient world about how Plato's account should be interpreted. One of the most common assumptions today is that the debate over Atlantis is a modern phenomenon. We often hear that Atlantis was obviously intended as a metaphor, while others insist it was obviously a real place. Yet when we examine Proclus, we discover that people were arguing about exactly the same issue more than 1,500 years ago. In his commentary on Plato's Timaeus, Proclus discusses earlier interpreters who disagreed about the nature of Atlantis. Some viewed the story as primarily a philosophical allegory. Others believed that Plato was describing a genuine historical event. In other words, the literal versus symbolic debate was already alive in antiquity. It was not invented by modern alternative researchers, conspiracy theorists, or internet forums. The argument is almost as old as the Atlantis story itself. Particularly important is Proclus's reference to Crantor, an early commentator on Plato who lived much closer to Plato's own lifetime. According to Proclus, Crantor regarded the Atlantis account as a true historical tradition rather than pure fiction. Proclus reports that Crantor claimed Egyptian records supported the story and treated Atlantis as an actual event preserved through ancient tradition. Now we need to be careful here. Proclus's statement does not prove Atlantis existed, nor does Crantor's acceptance of the story prove it was historically accurate. What it does demonstrate is that there were respected ancient scholars who believed Plato intended Atlantis to be understood as more than purely symbolic narrative. Whether they were correct is a separate question entirely. What makes Proclus particularly interesting is that he did not seem interested in reducing Atlantis to a simple either-or choice. Rather than insisting the story was exclusively historical or exclusively symbolic, he approached it through multiple layers of meaning. This was characteristic of Neoplatonic philosophy. For thinkers like Proclus, myths often contain several levels of truth simultaneously. A story could describe real events, convey philosophical principles, encode spiritual teachings, and serve as an initiatory text all at once. From that perspective, asking whether Atlantis was real or symbolic might be the wrong question altogether. The deeper question may be whether Plato intended the story to operate on several levels at the same time. Perhaps Atlantis represented a real civilization remembered through distant tradition. Perhaps it was also a moral lesson about the rise and fall of societies. Perhaps it functioned as an allegory for the human soul losing its connection to higher principles. In the ancient world, these possibilities were not necessarily considered mutually exclusive. This is one of the reasons Proclus remains so important to the Atlantis discussion. He does not provide archaeological proof. He does not reveal Atlantis's location. He does not solve the mystery. Instead, he preserves a valuable insight. The debate itself is ancient. People were asking whether Atlantis was history, allegory, philosophy, or some combination of all three long before the modern world ever inherited the question. And perhaps that leads us to an even more intriguing possibility. What if the ancient world did not separate history and symbolism as strictly as we do today? What if an account could simultaneously preserve the memory of a real event while also encoding deeper philosophical or initiatory teachings? Because if that is possible, then Atlantis may not need to be either history or myth. It could be both. Diodorus Siculus and the Atlanteans. Timeline, 90 to 30 BCE. Source, Bibliotheca Historica, the Library of History. Category, ancient, ethnographic, and mythic account. Several centuries after Plato, the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote about people known as the Atlanteans, whom he located in western North Africa near the Atlas Mountains. His accounts connect these peoples with divine rulers, Amazons, Titans, and a landscape that blends geography with mythology. Importantly, Diodorus is not describing Plato's Atlantis directly. He never confirms the existence of the island empire described in Timaeus and Critias. Instead, he records traditions associated with peoples and regions linked to the name Atlas and the far western edges of the known world. This distinction matters. The term Atlantean may originally have referred to people associated with Mount Atlas, the Atlas region of North Africa, or lands bordering the Atlantic Ocean, rather than a lost island civilization beneath the sea. That said, I just cannot read these names. Diodorus remains interesting because he demonstrates that traditions involving Atlas, Western lands, divine kings, and ancient peoples were circulating in the classical world independently of Plato's detailed Atlantis narrative. He provides cultural context, not confirmation. For historians, Diodorus is therefore best viewed as evidence that ancient Greeks associated the far west with powerful myths, legendary peoples, and forgotten histories. Whether any of these traditions relate to the Atlantis story remains open to interpretation. Curious question. Could the word Atlantean originally have described peoples connected to Mount Atlas or the Atlantic region rather than inhabitants of a lost island? And if multiple Greek writers preserved traditions about ancient Western peoples, divine rulers, and distant lands beyond the Mediterranean, could they represent different fragments of a much older civilization memory that has since become impossible to fully reconstruct? Ignatius Donnelly and the birth of the modern Atlantis theory. Timeline: 1831 to 1901. Key work: Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, 1882. Category: 19th century alternative history. If Plato gave Atlantis to the ancient world, it was Ignatius Donnelly who gave Atlantis to the modern world. Before Donnelly, Atlantis was largely regarded as an interesting philosophical mystery buried within Plato's writings. After Donnelly, it became something much bigger, a lost global civilization that may have stood at the root of many of the world's ancient cultures. In 1882, the American politician and writer published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, one of the most influential books ever written on the subject. Donnelly argued that Atlantis was not merely a myth or allegory, but a real civilization that existed before a great flood, an event he associated with many of the flood traditions preserved throughout human history. Donnelly's central idea was deceptively simple. He observed that ancient cultures on both sides of the Atlantic seemed to share certain similarities. Pyramid structures appeared in both Egypt and the Americas. Flood myths appeared in cultures across the world. Many societies preserved stories of divine civilizing beings who brought knowledge, agriculture, astronomy, and law. Rather than seeing these similarities as coincidences, Donnelly proposed a common source. That source, he argued, was Atlantis. According to Donnelly, Atlantis acted as a kind of mother civilization whose survivors spread across the world after a cataclysmic destruction. In his view, remnants of Atlantean knowledge eventually resurfaced in Egypt, Mesoamerica, and other centers of ancient civilization. The myths, monuments, agricultural practices, and symbolic traditions found across multiple cultures were interpreted as fragments of shared inheritance. It is difficult to overstate how influential this idea became. Many of the Atlantis theories that emerged during the 20th and 21st centuries, from Edgar Cayce to Graham Hancock, owe at least some intellectual debt to the framework Donnelly helped establish. The concept of a sophisticated lost civilization that existed before conventional history largely entered popular culture through his work. At the same time, it is important to understand the limitations of Donnelly's research. He was writing before modern archaeology had developed many of its current methods. He wrote before radiometric dating, before modern genetics, before plate tectonics, before satellite imagery, and before many major archaeological discoveries that have transformed our understanding of ancient cultures. As a result, some of his comparisons and conclusions were based on information that historians and archaeologists would later revise or reject. Today, most scholars would argue that cultural similarities do not automatically prove that two civilizations inherited their knowledge from a single parent civilization. Similar structures can emerge independently when different societies are solving similar problems. Really? Human beings everywhere observe the stars, grow crops, build monuments, and develop myths about creation, destruction, and survival. Yet despite these criticisms, Donnelly's work remains important because he asks questions that many researchers continue to ask today. Could humanity's history be older and more complex than we currently understand? Could rising seas have erased evidence of ancient coastal civilizations? And could fragments of forgotten knowledge still survive in myths, monuments, and traditions scattered around the world? Modern alternative history researchers often disagree with Donnelly's specific conclusions, but many continue to pursue the broader intuition that inspired him. The possibility that sophisticated societies may have existed long before timelines currently accepted by mainstream history. Whether Donnelly was ultimately right or wrong about Atlantis, he transformed the conversation forever. He took Atlantis out of the realm of classical philosophy and turned it into one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. A mystery that researchers, archaeologists, mystics, and dreamers are still debating nearly a century and a half later. Curious questions. If Donnelly was wrong about Atlantis being the direct source of every major ancient civilization, was he nevertheless asking the right question? And as more prehistoric sites continue to be discovered around the world, are we uncovering evidence that humanity's ancient past may have been far more sophisticated than we once imagined? It's about to get interesting. Edgar Cayce and the Atlantis readings. Timeline, 1877 to 1945. Category, psychic and clairvoyant testimony. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we've officially arrived at the point in the Atlantis investigation where the archaeologists start looking nervous. Because up until now, we've been discussing philosophers, historians, geologists, climate events, submerged landscapes, and giant stone monuments. Now we're about to enter the world of psychic readings. Welcome to Edgar Cayce. I feel like I've just been warming up, like the first episode, just planting some seeds, maybe making some engineers a little nervous. Then I had to get through all the Greek stuff and well done to the Greeks, don't get me wrong. I'm really glad they recorded all of that. It's just not a lot of it resonates with me. They did a fantastic job, but this is where it gets really good, okay? Edgar Cayce, known as the sleeping prophet, Cayce would enter a self-induced trance state and provide information on health, spirituality, reincarnation, ancient civilization, and humanity's forgotten past. During his lifetime, he gave thousands of readings, many of which were transcribed and preserved. Now, before anyone starts clutching their archaeology degrees in distress, let's be clear about something. Cayce's readings are not archaeology. They're not inscriptions. They're not carbon dated artifacts. They're not excavations. They belong in a completely different category of evidence, psychic testimony. But here's the interesting thing. Humanity has been accepting information claimed to come from divine, spiritual, or visionary sources for thousands of years. Many of the world's most influential religious traditions include prophets, sages, seers, mystics, and visionaries who received information through revelation, inspiration, dreams, or direct communication with a higher intelligence. In other words, if we're being honest, humanity has a long history of taking what we might now call divine downloads very seriously. In fact, much of the material that eventually became biblical scripture originated through exactly that process. Prophets received visions. Revelations were transmitted through dreams, angelic encounters, inspired states, mystical experiences, and direct communication with the divine. Whether one interprets those experiences spiritually, psychologically, or metaphysically, the mechanism is remarkably similar to what many modern people would describe as channeling. So while Cayce's work sits outside conventional archaeology, it doesn't sit outside the broader historical tradition of humanity seeking knowledge through altered states of consciousness. And Atlantis appears repeatedly throughout his readings. In fact, the Atlantis material emerged after a number of individuals receiving readings were unexpectedly told that they had once lived in Atlantis. As more sessions took place, a surprisingly detailed picture began to emerge. According to the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the organization that preserved Cayce's work, an entire body of readings was eventually devoted to Atlantis and its history. According to Cayce, Atlantis was not a single civilization that rose and fell overnight. Instead, he described multiple phases of Atlantean civilization spanning vast periods of time. At its height, Atlantis allegedly possessed technologies far beyond what we would normally associate with the ancient world. One of the most famous elements of the Cayce material is the recurring description of advanced energy systems. And yes, if you've been waiting for giant power crystals to enter the Atlantis story, your patience is now being rewarded. According to Cayce's readings, Atlanteans allegedly used enormous crystals capable of concentrating, amplifying, storing, and transmitting energy. These crystals appear repeatedly throughout the readings and are described as central components of Atlantean technology. Now, if you're listening to this while rolling your eyes, that's understandable. Maybe you should have a look though into how crystals are actually incorporated into modern technology though. I'm just saying. Maybe you should just have a little look into that. Little look-see, all right? If you're listening while opening a new browser tab titled Ancient Crystal Power Stations Explained, you're among friends. According to the readings, these technologies eventually became part of Atlantis' downfall. Cayce described political divisions emerging within the civilization, with competing factions disagreeing about how advanced technologies should be used. In this narrative, power, ambition, and the misuse of energy technologies ultimately contribute to a catastrophic destruction, which, if true, would make Atlantis less of a lost civilization story and more of an extremely aggressive warning label. Several of Cayce's readings also described survivors fleeing Atlantis prior to its final destruction. These groups allegedly migrated to regions including Egypt and the Americas, carrying fragments of Atlantean knowledge with them. This is where Cayce's narrative begins to overlap with themes we've already encountered in other traditions. Once again, we see the familiar pattern. A powerful civilization, a catastrophe, a small group of survivors, knowledge preserved, a new world emerging from ruins of the old. Cayce also introduced one of the most enduring Atlantis mysteries, the alleged Hall of Records. According to his readings, records of Atlantis were preserved in Egypt and concealed for future generations. Various interpretations place this repository beneath the Sphinx, beneath the Giza Plateau, or somewhere in the surrounding area. Needless to say, no Hall of Records containing Atlantean archives has been found. Well, at least they haven't told us. Anyway, although if archaeologists ever do uncover a hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx filled with crystal technology and Atlantean instruction manuals, I suspect several careers will need to be dramatically revised. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of the Cayce material involves reincarnation. Cayce repeatedly suggested that souls who once lived in Atlantis would return during future periods of major technological advancement. I will cut in here for a bit. These souls are what Dolores Cannon would describe as the three waves of volunteers, and the Law of One material would describe them as wanderer souls. We'll get back to that at another point. So, in his view, humanity periodically reaches moments where knowledge can be used either wisely or destructively. And many individuals alive today may be revisiting lessons they first encountered thousands of years ago in Atlantis. Again, none of this can be treated as conventional historical evidence. There are no excavated crystals, no Atlantean passports, no surviving power bills from a crystal energy grid. The value of the Cayce material is not archaeological verification. What makes it intriguing is something else. Despite emerging through psychic readings rather than historical research, the Atlantis narrative developed by Cayce contains themes that later appear in numerous other metaphysical traditions. Advanced technology, crystals, catastrophe, spiritual decline, survivors preserving knowledge, Egypt as a repository of ancient wisdom, the return of Atlantean souls during critical periods of human development. Whether these overlaps represent genuine insight, archetypal symbolism, cultural influence, collective memory, or something even stranger, is ultimately a matter of interpretation. But one thing is certain. By the time Edgar Cayce enters the Atlantis story, Atlantis is no longer just an archaeological mystery. It has become a spiritual mystery. And from this point forward, the line between history, mythology, consciousness, and metaphysics becomes increasingly difficult to see. Dolores Cannon and the mystery of convergent regression accounts. Timeline 1931 to 2014. Dolores, I love you. I'm a student of Dolores Cannon, so I just really respect her work. I really respect this body of work, because one thing about Dolores is that she was just so she never asked, when she put people under hypnosis through her QHHT sessions, she never asked any leading questions, ever. And she didn't go in with any ideas or concepts that would, twist her narrative. So if you research Dolores canon, or even if you just follow her books, I think there's about 17 of them, you'll see that her regression sessions evolve over time. So what starts as past life regression goes into her, I guess, realization that she could communicate with the source field or the higher self or the oversoul of her client, and then it gets more weird from there. And then she starts channeling all sorts of material, and she records it as she goes along in the convoluted universe. And that's why I just find her accounts so compelling, because yeah, she wasn't making it up. These were direct accounts coming through from her clients. So anyway, we can get back to that. So now we've arrived at the point in the Atlantis story where my QHHT colleagues are sitting forward in their chairs, while some of the archaeologists have quietly reached for a stress ball. Unlike Edgar Cayce, who received information while in trance, Dolores Cannon spent decades guiding other people into deep hypnotic states and recording what they reported. Over the course of her career, she developed what eventually became known as the quantum healing hypnosis technique, and she documented her findings across numerous books, including what I just said before, the Convoluted Universe series. Between Life and Death, The Custodians, Keepers of the Garden, The Three Waves of Volunteers, and many others. So as someone trained in and practicing QHHT, this is where my interest becomes more than purely academic. What fascinated Dolores wasn't a single Atlantis story, it was the pattern. Over decades of work, subjects from different countries, backgrounds, ages, professions, and belief systems repeatedly described remarkably similar themes. Many were not seeking information about Atlantis. Many came seeking help for health issues, life questions, relationships, spiritual growth, or personal healing. And yet Atlantis kept showing up again and again. This is where I think the discussion becomes genuinely interesting. Today, it's easy to dismiss recurring stories by assuming everyone watched the same documentary, joined the same Facebook group, or listened to the same podcast. But much of Dolores's work was conducted long before social media, long before the YouTube algorithm started feeding people an endless stream of Atlantis content, and in many cases, long before her own books documenting these accounts had ever been written and published. If one person reports an Atlantis memory, sure, that's interesting. If 10 people report it, that's curious. But what do we do when thousands of regression sessions conducted over decades begin producing similar themes? That doesn't automatically make the information historically true, but it does make it difficult to dismiss without at least asking why patterns exist. According to Canon's records, separate subjects repeatedly described Atlantis as a highly advanced civilization, possessing sophisticated energy technologies, unusual forms of power generation, and knowledge that integrated consciousness with science. Some accounts described advanced genetics, biological manipulation, and experimentation that blurred ethical boundaries. Others described a civilization becoming increasingly seduced by its own technological capabilities, believing it had outgrown the need for wisdom, restraint, or spiritual responsibility. If this sounds familiar, it's because we've already encountered versions of this narrative elsewhere. The same themes appear repeatedly throughout the Atlantis literature. A civilization achieves extraordinary advancement, technology outpaces wisdom, power exceeds responsibility. A division emerges between competing groups, and eventually catastrophe follows. Many of Cannon's subjects also described geological instability, earth changes, floods, and multiple contributing causes behind Atlantis' destruction. Rather than a single event, some accounts depicted a long decline punctuated by several disasters. Others describe survivors leaving before the final catastrophe and carrying knowledge into other regions, particularly Egypt. Again, whether those accounts are literal memories is impossible to prove, but the overlap itself is noteworthy. What makes Dolores' material particularly fascinating is how often it converges with themes found in other sources that originated through completely different processes. Edgar Cayce described advanced energy systems and crystal technologies. Dolores Cannon's subjects described advanced energy systems and crystal technologies. Many QHHT practitioners today continue to report clients spontaneously describing similar concepts during regression work. And this is where my own curiosity begins to take over. Because at some point, the question shifts. The question is no longer whether every detail is historically accurate. And the question becomes, why do the same motifs keep appearing across Cayce's readings, across Cannon's regressions, across modern QHHT sessions, across other metaphysical traditions, across decades, across countries, across people who have often never met one another? The recurring themes are remarkably consistent. There are repeated references to normal crystals and energy systems. There are descriptions of networks of energy or grids connecting different regions. There are accounts of scientific experimentation pushing beyond ethical boundaries. There are stories of two opposing factions disagreeing about how advanced technology should be used. There are accounts of evacuation before catastrophe. There are migrations into Egypt and other centers of civilization. And perhaps most intriguingly, there are recurring reports that many individuals alive today once participated in Atlantis and have returned during another pivotal technological period in human history. Now let's be completely honest about what this is and what it isn't. Regression isn't testimony, is not independently verified historical evidence. No archaeologist can excavate a hypnotic regression. No geologist can carbon date a memory. No historian can confirm a past life account through conventional methods. That is simply the reality. However, I also don't believe that just because information emerges through consciousness rather than through archaeology, it should automatically be discarded. Personally, I view these accounts as consciousness data. They may represent literal memories. They may represent symbolic narratives created by the subconscious. They may emerge from what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. They may involve access to information fields we don't yet understand, or they may be some combination of all of the above. The truth is, we don't know. But what I find impossible to ignore is the convergence. Because if one person dreamed about Atlantis, that's a story. If thousands of people, separated by geography and time, repeatedly describe similar civilizations, similar technologies, similar catastrophes, and similar lessons, then at a minimum, we are looking at a phenomenon that deserves serious attention. Whether Atlantis ultimately belongs to history, mythology, psychology, spirituality, or some category we haven't yet invented, Dolores Cannon leaves us with a fascinating challenge. How do so many people keep telling versions of the same story. Because if these accounts are not remembering Atlantis, then perhaps we need to explain why humanity keeps imagining it in such remarkably similar ways. It wouldn't make any sense. Anyway, Graham Hancock, Atlantis as a lost chapter of human history. Timeline 1990s to present. Key works: Fingerprints of the Gods, 1995. Underworld, 2002. Magicians of the Gods, 2015. And there's so much more. Category: Modern Alternative Hypothesis. If Ignatius Donnelly popularized the idea of Atlantis as a lost mother civilization, then Graham Hancock fundamentally reframed the conversation. Unlike many earlier Atlantis researchers, Hancock's strongest argument is not necessarily that Plato's island has been found or that Atlantis existed exactly as Plato described it. Instead, Hancock proposes something broader and in some ways more intriguing. His central argument is that humanity may have lost an advanced culture during the dramatic climate upheavals that occurred at the end of the last ice age, and that survivors of this lost world may have transmitted knowledge of civilizations that emerged afterwards. See, I know I've said that so many times, but it's just reinforcing it, really, in my mind. In Hancock's model, Atlantis may not be a single island waiting to be discovered beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Instead, Atlantis could represent a cultural memory of a forgotten phase of human civilization that existed before major catastrophic events reshaped the planet. Plato's story, from this perspective, may preserve a distant echo of real events, even if some details become mythologized over thousands of years. At the centre of Hancock's theory is a period known as the Younger Dryas. Around 12,900 years ago, just as Earth was emerging from the last ice age, global temperatures suddenly plunged and climatic conditions changed dramatically. For approximately 1,200 years, the warming trend was interrupted by a return to much colder conditions before temperatures began rising again. Hancock has argued that this period may represent one of the most consequential and disruptive eras in human prehistory. Hancock is particularly interested in the controversial Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which proposes that fragments of a large comet may have struck Earth or exploded in the atmosphere around this time. According to proponents of the theory, the resulting environmental turmoil could have triggered fires, climatic disruption, rapid ice melt, flooding, and widespread ecological change. Hancock argues that if advanced coastal societies existed at this time, they would have been especially vulnerable to destruction. Whether or not one accepts the impact hypothesis, there is one aspect of the story that is not controversial. Sea levels rose dramatically after the Ice Age. Over thousands of years, global oceans increased by more than 120 metres, submerging vast coastal plains that had once been dry land. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath the sea. Regions such as Doggerland in northern Europe and Sunderland in Southeast Asia were slowly inundated as melting ice sheets poured water back into the oceans. For Hancock, this raises an obvious question. If most ancient populations preferred to settle near rivers, lakes, estuaries and coastlines as humans still do today, then where would the oldest evidence of their civilization now be located? The answer is straightforward. It's underwater. Hancock argues that archaeologists have explored only a fraction of the landscapes that existed at the end of the Ice Age, because many of those landscapes no longer exist above sea level. In his view, the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. when the areas most likely to contain early coastal settlements have been submerged for thousands of years. This idea became the foundation of one of his most ambitious books, Underworld. In that work, Hancock investigated submerged landscapes and underwater sites around the world, exploring whether traces of ancient habitation might survive beneath modern seas. He examined underwater structures near India, Japan, and other coastal regions, including the famous controversial Yogaguni monument off the coast of Japan. Some researchers interpret Yogaguni as a natural formed geological feature, while others see evidence of human modification. Hancock approaches such sites as potential clues rather than definitive proof, arguing that they deserve more investigation than they often receive. Another major pillar of Hancock's work involves flood myths. As we've already seen, stories of catastrophic floods appear across cultures across the world. Hancock argues that these recurring narratives may preserve fragmented memories of the profound environmental changes that occurred as the Ice Age ended. Rather than viewing flood myths as purely symbolic, he suggests that they may contain distorted cultural memories of real events experienced by ancient populations. Hancock also became interested in archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient cultures observed and incorporated celestial phenomena into their monuments and belief systems. He points to the sophisticated astronomical alignments found at many ancient sites and asks whether this knowledge could have originated from a tradition older than the civilizations that eventually recorded it. While mainstream archaeology generally explains such achievements through the ingenuity of the cultures that built them, Hancock entertains the possibility that some knowledge was inherited from predecessors whose identities have been lost to history. One of the discoveries that has given additional momentum to such discussions is Göbekli Tepe. Sorry, I just can't pronounce these sites. That's located in modern-day Turkey. Dating back to roughly 9,600 BCE, Göbekli Tepe challenged long-standing assumptions about the sophistication of late Ice Age societies. Here was a monumental ceremonial complex built thousands of years before Stonehenge and the pyramids of Egypt. While mainstream archaeologists do not see Göbekli Tepe as evidence of a lost advanced civilization, its existence demonstrates that humans at the end of the Ice Age were capable of far more organizational complexity than previously assumed. For Hancock, sites like it's just not getting any easier. It's not getting any easier. Göbekli Tepe suggests that humanity's prehistoric past may still hold major surprises. This leads to one of the most fascinating aspects of Hancock's theory, the idea of cultural survivors. If an advanced Ice Age culture were destroyed by catastrophe, what would happen to the survivors? Hancock suggests that small groups carrying specialized knowledge may have traveled into the post-Ice Age world, sharing astronomy, agriculture, architecture, mathematics, and sacred traditions with emerging societies. Over generations, these wise teachers could have become mythologized. Am I saying that correctly? Mythologized. Eventually being remembered as gods, civilizing heroes or culture bringers. Traditions such as, oh, here we go again. Okay. Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Viracocha in South America, or other legendary teachers found around the world are sometimes viewed through this lens by alternative researchers. Thank you for putting up with my terrible pronunciation. I hope you're laughing at me. Okay, it is crucial, however, to maintain perspective. Hancock's lost civilization model remains highly disputed and is not accepted as established archaeology. Most archaeologists reject the idea that a technologically advanced global civilization existed at the end of the Ice Age and argue that the available evidence does not support Hancock's conclusions. Yeah. I don't know. I'm sure everyone has their own thoughts on this whole mainstream archaeology, mainstream science, mainstream institutions, mainstream everything. And surely questions how much of it is being controlled, restricted, and by whom. I'll just say that. At the same time, some of the observations that motivate Hancock's investigations are unquestionably real. Late Ice Age sea level rise is real. Drowned coastal landscapes are real. Submerged prehistoric habitats are real. The incompleteness of the archaeological record is real, and discoveries such as Göbekli Tepe demonstrate that our understanding of prehistory continues to evolve as new evidence emerges. Ultimately, Hancock's greatest contribution may not be that he solved the Atlantis mystery. It may be that he persuaded millions of people to ask a question that archaeology itself increasingly confronts. How much of humanity's earliest story still lies hidden beneath the oceans, buried beneath ancient sediments, or waiting to be discovered in places we've barely begun to explore? And if a lost chapter of civilization truly existed before the end of the Ice Age, Atlantis may not have been a single place at all. It may have been the memory of an entire world that disappeared when the seas rose. Robert Schoch and the Rain-Weathered Sphinx. Timeline, 1990s to present. Category, Geological Alternative Hypothesis. By this point in the Atlantis investigation, you may have noticed a recurring pattern. Someone looks at an ancient monument and says, "That's older than we're told." An archaeologist says, "No, it isn't." A geologist says, "Well, actually." And then everyone disappears into a 20-year academic argument. Enter Dr. Robert Schoch. Unlike many Atlantis researchers, Schoch's original work wasn't focused on finding a lost civilization. He is a geologist, and his attention was drawn to a very specific question: the weathering patterns surrounding the Great Sphinx at Giza. According to conventional Egyptology, the Sphinx was built around 2500 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. Schoch, however, argued that the weathering visible on the enclosure walls surrounding the Sphinx appears more consistent with long-term exposure to substantial rainfall than with wind-blown sand erosion alone. The problem is that Egypt has not experienced that kind of sustained rainfall for a very long time. If Schoch is correct, then at least parts of the Sphinx complex may be significantly older than the traditionally accepted date. Some interpretations of his work place the earliest phases of the monuments thousands of years earlier, potentially reaching back toward the end of the Ice Age. Now let's be very careful here. Schoch does not prove Atlantis existed. He is not standing on the Sphinx saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have found Atlantis." What his work does is raise legitimate questions about chronology, It encourages us to ask whether some sacred sites may have more complex histories than we currently understand, involving multiple phases of construction, restoration, and adaptation over thousands of years. And this is where his work becomes relevant to the Atlantis discussion. If major sacred sites such as Giza contain elements that are older than conventionally assumed, then the possibility emerges that certain knowledge traditions may have survived from a much earlier epoch of human history. That doesn't automatically mean Atlantis. It doesn't automatically mean a lost civilization, but it does widen the conversation about what humans may have been capable of in deep antiquity. Perhaps the most refreshing thing about Schock is that he doesn't simply say yes to every mystery that crosses his desk. In the world of alternative history, there is sometimes a tendency to see an ancient lost civilization behind absolutely everything. Mysterious rock, Atlantis. Strange hill, Atlantis. Oddly shaped cloud, Atlantis. Schock has often taken a more cautious approach. For example, while Graham Hancock explored the possibility that the underwater formations at Yoganuni near Japan may contain evidence of human involvement, Schock has argued that much of the formation can be explained through natural geological processes. In other words, he has been willing to reject mystery claims when he believes the evidence doesn't support them. That is an important point because alternative researchers are often portrayed as a single unified group moving in lockstep. In reality, they frequently disagree with one another, sometimes quite passionately. Hancock and Schock agree on some questions, disagree on others, and arrive at different conclusions from similar evidence. For me, that's actually where the discussion becomes interesting. The goal shouldn't be to force every mystery into an Atlantis-shaped box. The goal should be to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when the answer is less dramatic than we hoped. Unfortunately, my personal preference is that every mystery eventually leads to either Atlantis, an ancient wisdom tradition, a megalithic power station, or a crystal capable of opening a stargate. Science continues to resist my efforts. What Schock contributes to this investigation is not proof of Atlantis, but a reminder that the ancient world may still contain surprises. If he's right, then some of humanity's most iconic monuments could be preserving layers of history that stretch deeper into the past than we can currently recognise. And if that is true, then the question becomes even more intriguing. Not whether Atlantis has been found, but whether fragments of a much older world may already be staring us in the face, and we've been walking past them for centuries. I'm excited. David Wilcock, and the moment your family starts worrying about your search history. Timeline. 1990s until sadly 2026. Rest in peace, David Wilcock. I know we can still talk to you though. Category. Modern synthesis of esoteric testimony and speculative physics. So now we've arrived at one of my favourite steps on the Atlantis journey, David Wilcock. This is usually the point in the investigation where your research ceases to resemble a normal historical inquiry and starts looking like the evidence board from a detective show. There are strings connecting pyramids to sacred geometry to consciousness, consciousness to frequencies, frequencies to ancient monuments, and somehow everything ends up pointing back to Atlantis. At some point during my own research, I realised I had crossed an invisible line. I was no longer simply reading about Atlantis. I was reading about consciousness fields, harmonic resonance, non-local awareness, ancient builders, the law of one, Russian torsion field theories, crystal technologies, and whether giant rocks could potentially become lighter through frequency manipulation. My search history stopped saying interested in ancient history and started saying, please check on this woman. What makes Wilcock particularly interesting is that he doesn't present Atlantis as an isolated subject. Instead, he attempts to weave together an enormous number of different traditions and theories into a single model. His work draws heavily from Edgar Cayce's Atlantis readings, concepts found in the Law of One Material, sacred geometry, ancient monument mysteries, consciousness research, resonance phenomena, and various speculative interpretations of physics. Rather than viewing these as separate topics, Wilcock argues they may all be describing different aspects of the same underlying reality. In Wilcock's framework, Atlantis was not simply technologically advanced. It was advanced because it understood consciousness itself as a science. And that is a very different proposition. Most modern civilization largely treats consciousness as something produced by the brain. Ridiculous. In the world that Wilcock describes, consciousness is fundamental. Reality is not just physical matter. Consciousness, energy, geometry, vibration, and matter are all interconnected aspects of the same underlying field. And we will go there when we go into quantum mechanics, but not yet. Now, before we all jump into a crystal-powered spaceship and head for another dimension, let's separate what is actually established from what remains speculative. It is absolutely true that sound creates vibration. Resonance is a well-established physical phenomenon. Acoustic levitation exists and has been demonstrated in laboratory environments. Ultrasound can manipulate tiny particles, droplets, and materials. Certain crystals exhibit piezoelectric properties, generating electrical charges under pressure. Vibrations can move, fracture, shape, and reorganize matter in specific circumstances. All of that is real. All right? No Atlantis required. No crystal skull required. No dramatic chanting required. What remains speculative is the question of scale. Wilcock explores the possibility that an ancient civilization operating under a completely different scientific paradigm may have discovered applications of resonance far beyond anything we currently use. One of the concepts he discusses is the idea that precisely tuned acoustic and electromagnetic fields could potentially affect the behavior of matter in ways that we do not presently understand. This is where the discussion starts becoming wonderfully dangerous to your credibility at dinner parties, because we move from scientists can levitate tiny droplets with sound to could an ancient civilization have manipulated gigantic stone blocks through resonance? And from there, the conversation escalates with absolutely no regard for public safety. Could stone become lighter if we were in a different dimension? One might assume. If we weren't vibrating so low in 3D. Just saying. Could matter become more malleable? Could massive blocks be moved without conventional machinery? Could advanced knowledge of vibration alter the relationship between matter and gravity? And eventually, someone in the conversation inevitably asks, wait, are we talking about anti-gravity? At which point half the room quietly leaves. But if I'm being completely honest, I'd argue that the people leaving probably weren't bringing main character energy to the script anyway. One of Wilcock's more controversial ideas involve what some people call stone dematerialisation. The basic proposition is that if a civilization understood resonance at a sufficiently advanced level, it might be able to temporarily alter the behaviour of matter. In some versions of the theory, stone could become lighter. In others, it could become easier to shape or manipulate. In the most extreme versions, matter itself could be shifted into a different energetic state. To be absolutely clear, none of this has been demonstrated or proven on our current timeline that we're aware of. Okay? No one we're aware of today has successfully turned a 50-ton granite block into the geological equivalent of warm butter. But, you know, you can Google how many anti-gravity scientists have disappeared. I won't say anything further about it, but you can research that yourself, because I tell you what, it's a lot, and I think there's probably only Bob Lazar left. So go down that rabbit hole if you want to. Allegedly, no Atlantean anti-gravity machine has been discovered. And no archaeologist has accidentally... Fuck. I love this bit in his book. It's so good. I'm referring to this book, The Source Field Investigations. He's got some great experiments in there. Okay. Oh, no archaeologist has accidentally faced... No. Oh, I can't even say it. No archaeologist has accidentally phased through a wall while excavating a pyramid. Not at least that anyone has admitted publicly. But this is where I find Wilcock fascinating. He's not really asking us to believe that all of these things happened. He's asking us to question whether our assumptions about what is possible might be limited by our current understanding. Because every civilization tends to assume it has reality mostly figured out. Then reality humbles the fuck out of it. A few hundred years ago, radio would have sounded like magic. Wireless communication would have sounded absurd. The internet would have gotten you burned as a witch, or at a minimum, excluded from the village newsletter. Today, they're ordinary. So Wilcock asks a provocative question. If resonance can already influence matter at a small scale, what might a civilization discover if it spent thousands of years developing a science centered on frequency, geometry, consciousness, and energy, rather than combustion engines, fossil fuels, and silicon chips? It's a reasonable fucking question, okay? This has gone off the rails and I love it. Okay. This is ultimately where Atlantis transforms from an archaeological mystery into something much bigger. In Wilcock's model, Atlantis wasn't remembered because it had better machines. It wasn't remembered because it had larger buildings. It wasn't remembered because it possessed slightly more efficient methods of moving rocks. It was remembered because it may have understood reality itself differently. A civilization that viewed consciousness as a fundamental force. A civilization that saw geometry as functional rather than decorative. A civilization that understood resonance not merely as a property of sound, but as a principle woven into the fabric of existence. Do I think every one of Wilcock's ideas has been proved? No. Do some of them sound a little outrageous? Perhaps. Have I found myself at 1 a.m. reading one or more chapter because I've somehow invested in the possibility that sacred geometry, consciousness fields, ancient pyramids, and Atlantean science could all be connected? Absolutely. Repeatedly. Because whether he's right or wrong, Wilcock poses a question that refuses to go away. What if the greatest technology Atlantis possessed wasn't a machine? What if it was a radically different understanding of consciousness, energy, and reality itself? And if that's even remotely possible, then we're no longer talking about a lost civilization. We're talking about a lost way of understanding the universe. Wrapping up part 1. So where does all of this leave us? Let's step back for a moment. We started with the flood myths from every corner of the world. We looked at Plato's accounts of Atlantis and discovered that the debate over whether it was literal or symbolic didn't begin in YouTube in 2012, okay? It was already being argued in the ancient world. We followed the trail through writers like Proclus, Diodorus. We examined Donnelly's lost mother civilization theory, Hancock's lost ice age civilization, Schock's question about antiquity, Cayce's psychic readings, Cannon's thousands of regression accounts, and finally took a deep breath and wandered into David Wilcock's universe, where consciousness, geometry, frequency, Atlantis, and physics all somehow end up at the same amazing dinner table. Now, am I claiming that any one of these sources proves Atlantis? No, but here's what I find difficult to ignore. A geologist looking at weathering patterns ends up questioning the timelines. An alternative historian looking at submerged coastlines ends up questioning timelines. Ancient flood myths point towards a catastrophe. Plato points towards a catastrophe. Cayce points towards a catastrophe. Canon subjects point towards a catastrophe. The law of one points towards the same thing. Even geology points towards dramatic upheavals at the end of the Ice Age. Everyone seems to keep arriving in the same neighbourhood. They're just taking different roads to get there. And that's where my curiosity starts getting the better of me. Because at some point, you stop asking whether every witness remembered the event perfectly and start asking why so many people keep describing the same basic story. Okay? A great civilization, advanced knowledge, a moral or ethical decline, a catastrophe, survivors, knowledge preservation, Egypt. A warning for the future. Now, perhaps all of that is coincidence. If you read the Kybalion and anything about Hermetics, which we'll get to again at some point, you'll realize that there is no such thing as coincidence. There's no such thing as the laws of the universe. I'll let you draw your own conclusions on that though. So skeptics might say coincidence. Perhaps it's mythology. Perhaps it's psychology. Perhaps it's symbolism. Perhaps it's collective unconscious material. Or perhaps we're looking at fragmented memories of something real that has been filtered through thousands of years of storytelling, religion, philosophy, mystery schools, dreams, visions, regression sessions, and human imagination. We can't prove it, but I'll tell you what I do know. If you stacked all of this evidence into 4 separate boxes labeled history, mythology, geology, and consciousness research, I'd expect those boxes to tell completely different stories. Instead, they keep leaning toward one another like they're trying to have a secret conversation. And that to me is where the mystery lives. Because the further I've gone down this rabbit hole, the the less Atlantis looks like a story about a sunken island. It starts looking like a story about missing history, about knowledge that may have been preserved in unexpected places, about ancient monuments that may have been built for reasons we don't fully understand, about wisdom traditions that insist humanity once knew more than we've been taught. And perhaps most importantly, about the possibility that some things were intentionally preserved while other things were intentionally forgotten. Now that's either a fascinating mystery or I've read far too many books and my family needs to stage an intervention. The jury's still out, but what I can say is this: if Atlantis was real, or if there's even a grain of truth buried inside the story, then the really interesting question isn't where Atlantis was. The interesting question is, what was Atlantis? What kind of civilization produces stories of giant crystals, energy systems, sacred geometry, consciousness technology, advanced astronomy, mystery schools, and knowledge so valuable that survivors supposedly carried it across the world after a cataclysm? Because that's exactly where we're heading next. In part 2, we're leaving behind the question of whether Atlantis existed and diving into something far stranger. What was Atlantis actually capable of? We'll explore the claims of crystal technology, resonance, consciousness-based science, energy grids, sacred geometry, the law of one, competing Atlantean factions, the Melchizedek traditions, and the possibility that Atlantis wasn't simply technologically advanced, but operating from an entirely different understanding of reality. So strap yourselves in, charge your crystals, align your chakras, recalibrate your frequency, or do whatever you personally do before discussing ancient interdimensional civilizations. Because from this point onward, the weirdness is no longer warming up. The weirdness has officially arrived. I'm not gently leading you down the rabbit hole anymore. I'm grabbing you by the ankles and throwing you head first into the 5th dimension. Welcome to the cosmic fucking basement. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, stay kind, and never stop asking questions, because one question might just change your life. Spiral the fuck out and keep going, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much.